I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm responding to Russell Brand's interview of Dr. Brad Evans called Are We Living in a Totalitarian Regime and Don't Even Know It? This is very exciting because I started Under the Skin from the beginning and from the end. And so I heard the first episode that interviewed Brad Evans and subsequent interviews, ones where he co-hosted, and then one where he interviewed Russell, all of which have been very fun. I think that Brad is a really interesting thinker. I also think that our job is to imagine what could be in the full knowledge of what is. If there is anyone grounded in the reality of what is, it's a professor of political violence. In that, I think that Russell and I agree fully. I happened to look at Russell's Wikipedia page today, and in it, it talks about his first activism as opposing Operation Cast Lead, the 2009 Israeli assault on Gaza. At that time, I had a pirate radio show called Third Paradigm, and I had episodes called Friends Don't Let Friends Condone Genocide. So those are the kinds of issues in which we are in full agreement, which means that now the conversation we can have is just fine-tuning the nuances. It's right at that growing tip of information, and that's the place that I love to be. So let's get started. I'm calling this episode Conspiracy Theorist as the New Heretic, because I think that what Brad is talking about with the techno-theocracy is very compelling, that he is onto something with looking at the religious fervor with which we have adopted our beliefs about the pandemic. What he says is that to the left, the pandemic is untouchable. It is completely off limits. It's acquired the status of sacred object, and that the pandemic is about sacrifice. It's about how much you can sacrifice for the good of others. So how has the left come to this place of obedience to authority? If I were to characterize it, the right and the left, it would have been before that the right was more authoritarian and was much easier to organize because of that. The left was like herding cats. You couldn't get anything done. But now that has been reversed. How has that happened? I've said before that I think that the right can be manipulated through fear, but that the left is manipulated through guilt. Guilt, I think, is fear in another form, and maybe a more powerful form of it, because guilt calls for punishment. And so there's a sense of being willing to almost be relieved when the bad things happen, when the sanctions happen, to give up those freedoms, because there is this oppressive sense that you just don't deserve it. Brad even talks about how it has called into question the sanctity of being human, that even our singularity as humans is something that we don't even see ourselves as deserving. So how has this dogma been encouraged? Another thing that Brad says is that if power seems obvious, it's probably not there. I did a recent episode on Yuval Noah Harari, in which he says that if you have a little bit of power, you exaggerate it. But if you have a lot of power, you hide it. So where is power hiding? And how did it get to this place? An example of how I think we have a new religion and not just a simple difference of opinions anymore, is my local independent bookstore, which has been a form of church for me for the last 40 years. I found out recently that they are refusing to carry Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Dr. Fauci. That, to me, was such a contradiction in terms, because if there's anything that a book stands for, it's the ability of a person to think for themselves, to be able to tell the difference between truth and illusion, to be able to go mind to mind with the greatest thinkers, as John Taylor Gatto said in a recent podcast that I did. So even an independent bookstore is further along those lines, is someone who believes in their readers, who believes in the intelligence of the average person, who can look at a book and understand what are the facts. So we've come to a place that I didn't expect to be in my lifetime. And how did that happen? I think one clue as to how that happened is in this book. And I don't want to bring down the gods of the techno-theocracy, because even though that same Wikipedia page on Russell said that last month YouTube is now researching to make sure that he has not violated their COVID protocol, I think that his 4.5 million viewers would be much welcomed by Rumble. However, my 43 viewers would not be much missed by YouTube. So I'm not going to tell you that you should read this book because of what it says about Dr. Fauci's role in COVID. I'm going to say you should read it to understand his role in AIDS and in changing the narrative, in changing the dogma. I'm not going to touch on the horrifying details in this book, which would require 440 pages with no margins and endnotes that require a magnifying glass to read. Instead, what I want to look at is how science was replaced with a new form of religious dogma. So the story that I want to look at is that of Peter Duesberg. He was the leading cancer virologist, someone who was well on his way to cracking the genome of cancer. In 1987, he published a cancer article in which he had 2 paragraphs that questioned the narrative of HIV. That was something that wasn't scientifically wrong, but according to Fauci, it was politically incorrect. And because of that, no grant that he ever requested after that was given. He was completely defunded. Cancer research that he was working on was stopped in its tracks, and he was the best of the best. This sent shockwaves through the scientific community. One of the scientists interviewed teared up talking about it because everyone knew that that public assassination meant that they could be next, that there were things that you could no longer say, and it didn't matter whether you were right. What mattered was whether you were what was then called politically correct, what is now called woke. And that was the beginning of cancel culture. In that way, the entire basis of science, empirical knowledge and standards, was taken away and replaced with an imperial narrative. Because as we've talked about before, the idea of race and gender preferences and religion, none of that really challenges the money pyramid. And that funding empire stayed intact and couldn't be challenged by someone by bringing facts and knowledge to it. So what is a conspiracy theorist as the new heretic? One of Russell's commenters on his Rumble account wrote, "A conspiracy theorist should be seen as the new reality prophet." I say that a conspiracy theorist is what investigative journalism used to be before it became infotainment and an arm of propaganda. When you used to do investigative journalism, you developed a theory. You looked at things that were going on under the surface that weren't obvious. And then you found the research, you found facts, and you put them together with logic in order to bring something to light. These days, each of us has to be our own investigative journalist. But none of us are getting paid for that job. No one's getting paid for that job these days. And so you've got to figure out who to trust. That's where I think it's important to be paying attention to what I call the propaganda double agent. Propaganda is very different than a lie. What propaganda does is it takes the truth and lies and it interweaves them into a seamless garment. And so you look at it and you say, well, I know that's true and that's true and that and that. And you at the same time are swallowing all these other lies. But then there's the flip side. And the flip side is that you say, well, that's a lie and that's ridiculous and that doesn't make sense. And you bury the truth in with them so that when you reject these other things, you are also rejecting the truth. At one point, Russell is talking about how he used to interview David Icke, I think his name is pronounced, and how he was a strange blend of conspiracy theories that made a lot of sense, and then these other things that were fantastic. And so that may be an example. I've wondered whether Alex Jones is a propaganda double agent, that he says a lot of things that I agree with, but then he says other things that are very easy to dismiss. But the number one person I suspect of being a propaganda double agent is Trump. That what Trump did was that he said all sorts of things that were ridiculous, that were horrifying, that were offensive, and that turned people vitriolically against him. And then he buried some things that were the truth in there. And when he turned against Dr. Fauci, he made Dr. Fauci into the number one hero of the left. I don't think that was an accident. I think that we have been massively played. In that way, I think that Trump was part of the Great Reset setup. The last thing I want to look at is whether the hierarchy of ideas in an empirical analogy was replaced by a hierarchy of victimization, whether we now have people vying for who are the greatest victims. Glenn Greenwald has an article where he talks about that if you are white and something bad happens to you, you can't talk about it without first acknowledging all of the people to whom that sort of thing happens regularly. And Matt Taibbi also has a very funny article called Thanksgiving is Awesome. He says from the mashed potatoes to the demented relatives to the pumpkin pie to the farts. And he says that now we are in this orgy of self-flagellation where you can't enjoy Thanksgiving without first nodding and genuflecting and acknowledging all of the people that were annihilated in order to bring you that holiday. What he says is that we've taken two extremes. We've gone from a history that was entirely sanitized to one that is cleanly divided into villains and victims, or, as he says, Hitlers and baby seals. So how do we start bringing nuance back into that narrative and both acknowledge the history and acknowledge that we have a place that we deserve to be in it, and that power is not privilege, that having what any human should deserve is not a matter of privilege. It's a matter of right. I think that Russell is absolutely right that if we're going to bring verve and vitality back into the revolution, we need more transgressive, outrageous figures like Oscar Wilde and Hunter Thompson and Gore Vidal and Kurt Vonnegut. We need to be embracing our diversity, not just in things like race and gender, but in how we think and who we are, and our individuality and our humanity. So let's celebrate each other. And the way to get out of guilt and fear is through forgiveness and love, corny as it is. If you like this, here's another one, kind of along the same crazy lines, and here's a playlist that probably has a lot of them. And I would love it if you would subscribe. Thank you.